There are really four main types of Christian schools. And I think it's really important to take some time and to figure out where you fit in this spectrum of four different types of schools, and to be intentional about who you're going to be and why, and getting other people on board with it. So let's talk about this and we'll see where it takes us. Now, I've written about this, talked about it quite a bit over time, and I've written some papers on it. It's in my book, Faithful and Flourishing. It's in a number of presentations, but I'll just do it right here in this video in a quick, informal way for you. So the first one is a remnant school. And a remnant school is one that started with a Christian mission. Your Christian identity was really clear from the beginning, but then over time you just sort of morphed into a private school. That Christian mission, that original mission, is just not as front and center anymore. And people are okay with it just being a great private school, or a private school that's meeting a need in the community and people are happy with it. It's not too religious. It's not, it has sort of religious undertones, maybe some values and virtues, but it's really just a private school, and hopefully a good private school. I'm not really interested in focusing my time and energy on the remnant schools out there, but it is a type of school that exists. I've seen it, and it does happen. And by the way, most Christian schools who started with a really clear, strong mission and they became remnant schools, it usually happened as that school began to separate itself from other entities, from its sponsoring denomination, from its original sponsoring congregations, from maybe a particular association of Christian schools with a shared confession, shared set of beliefs, that usually schools that are kind of islands in and of themselves over time, they just kind of follow the wave of the convictions of the different leaders that are picked. And you get certain board members that come in and maybe they're not experienced with Christian education, and they're not particularly attentional, and then the hiring decisions that happen. Then over time, it just becomes a private school, and the larger values of society tend to be the ones that are predominant within the school as well. And that's not an uncommon thing to happen. So it is important to be intentional and to think about who you're going to be and who you believe you're best positioned and called to be. The other side of the spectrum we might call a covenant school. I sometimes call it cloistered campus too, but a covenant school is one that is really a school that's designed to serve a very specific group of students, usually from a shared denomination. So it might be a school by Catholics for Catholics, by Lutherans for Lutherans, by Baptists for Baptists, by Christians for Christians. And then you have a kind of a code of conduct and a list of core Christian beliefs. And then any student or family that chooses to attend, they sign on. Literally, sometimes they sign and they make an agreement. Yep, we're on board with this. We agree. And of course, the faculty and staff are all on board. They work really hard to get people who are really committed and on board. So that's a covenant school. And covenant schools can actually be quite beautiful when you watch them because they have this really strong ethos. I mean, it's a distinctly Catholic school and it has the Catholic rituals, the Catholic practices, the vocabulary, the stories. There's you're with your people. People who have your most deeply held beliefs and convictions and values, and you nurture that in one another, and iron sharpens iron in these kinds of communities, and you develop friendships that sometimes last a lifetime in these types of communities. So some people are kind of negative about the remnant schools, but they can actually be quite powerful. Now, that's not where I've chosen to spend most of my time or energy, but I have helped schools that have chosen to become a type of a covenant school, and they can be very powerful and they can serve their audiences really well, and their families and their students are often incredibly loyal to the school because they have that shared sense of identity. It helps actually with fundraising. It can be powerful with enrollment and all sorts of things for the schools that do it well. There are always some ways to do it not so well as not so well as well, but that's that. So then we have the remnant school and we have the covenant school. What about in between? And there are two types that I'll talk about. One I'll describe as just a missional school, and this is a school that you try to get faculty and staff who are on board with your mission. And missional schools define that differently. Sometimes they want 100% of their board and their faculty and their staff to really be crystal clear about who they are, their core beliefs, their core convictions. How closely aligned they are is going to vary from school to school, but they want to have the main thing among everyone. And then they open their doors to anyone and everyone in terms of students. The missional schools tend to not limit the student population based upon their religious background. So you might have a really religiously diverse group of students in these schools. Now, by the way, missional schools sometimes are not as particular about their faculty and staff and their board. And they say, well, we just want a critical mass of faculty and staff. And if 50% of our faculty and staff are on board with the mission, that's good. And that can make for a kind of complex culture because you have faculty whose messages are conflicting and clashing with one another. And there can be kind of competing battles over policies and practices and core values and other things like that. And that's just a nature of schools that choose to have more kind of religious diversity among their faculty and staff. But a lot of missional schools really try to have all or as many as possible their faculty, staff, and board on board with their core mission and their core beliefs. But then the students, you open your doors to the students, and it makes for an interesting and can be an incredibly powerful ministry. These are schools where sometimes young people come to faith and they're baptized, and they are introduced to Jesus for the first time in their lives. And then other students are coming from Christian backgrounds. Sometimes the students coming from Christian backgrounds, these missional schools are sometimes designed really well to give the spiritual meat to the mature Christian students and to give the milk to the students who are young in their faith or maybe are unbelievers when they come in. And other missional schools really don't think in a really intentional way about that. So they just kind of give the same spiritual meal to everyone and hope it works. But that does oftentimes cause some problems and some challenges for missional schools if they're not intentional, if they don't think about it. So the key is just to be intentional and to think about it. I've seen missional schools serve a multiplicity of different types of students in terms of their religious backgrounds and do it really well. But it takes a great deal of effort, and it takes very, very skilled and thoughtful and often well-educated teachers who have thought deeply about this, and they learn how to do this. It's not something that just because you're a Christian, you know how to do it. You have to actually study and practice it over time in order to do this kind of ministry really well, educational ministry well. And then there's a fourth kind of Christian school that I would call a critical mass school. Now, there are a couple of other authors who've used the phrase critical mass, and when they're talking about critical mass, they're talking about a critical mass of the faculty and staff who are on board with the mission. I'm not actually doing that. In this case, I'm talking about a critical mass school is usually where 100% of your faculty, staff, and your board is on board with your mission and your shared convictions, your shared confession. And then you aim for a critical mass of students. So you aim for sometimes 50, 60, 70%, could be more of your students who are really on board with why you exist and what you believe. Now, again, it can vary, just like with missional schools, on how precise schools are about that. Like some say, we're a Catholic school and we want 70% of our students to always be from a Catholic family, a Catholic background, and that's going to be a critical mass, because then those students help set the stage. They influence the culture and the ethos in a way that's a witness to the students who maybe don't come from a Catholic background. They realize that the students are part of the curriculum. The students are a blessing to one another, and their beliefs and values are shared with one another in those informal settings. And that's what critical mass schools are really thinking about. They're trying to think intentionally about the population of students that they're recruiting. They're trying to curate a community of students that creates a kind of culture that's a great blessing to every student that they admit they enroll. So you could picture a critical mass school that says, we want to have 60% of the students from our denomination, our denominational background, and we want another 20 or 25% to be of closely aligned Christian denominations, so we're at 85%. And then the other 15% may be people who don't have a church home, and some because they're unbelievers, and some because maybe they were Christians and they got disconnected from a church and have never sort of reconnected since. And so you practice Christian hospitality to that 15%. And of course, those who are coming from without a church background, there might be a little bit of a shock in that culture, because there are a lot of distinctives about the Christian identity and the denominational identity sometimes. And so practicing Christian hospitality is valuable. The example that I give of a critical mass school is I invite people over to my house for dinner. Anyone is welcome to my house. Doesn't matter what you believe or other things like that. Of course, you have to maybe behave well. If someone's violent, I'm probably not going to invite them to my house for dinner. But you come into my house, and we'll try to prepare a great meal for you. We'll have a good time. We'll have great conversation, have a little fun together, and I'm not going to hide the Christian books. I'm not going to take the Christian art off the wall. And when we sit down for the meal, I'm going to say a word of prayer for us at that dinner table. And we're a Christian family, and we're a Christian home, and we're unashamed about that. But we're also welcoming and inviting of other people who have different backgrounds. Again, we're not compromising on who we are, but you're welcome if you're okay with that. And that's oftentimes how these critical mass schools operate. So those 4 types of Christian schools, I encourage you to think about this. Where do you fit? And maybe to have this conversation with others in your school. Where do we think we should be? Where do we want to be over time? And what would it take for us to get there? That kind of intentionality is really the key to being faithful and flourishing.